Punjab, India. A sacred river stretching 160 kilometers long. For decades, it functioned as an open sewer, industrial waste, agricultural runoff, raw sewage. Villages dumped everything directly into the water. Fish vanished. The water turned black. Government studies accumulated. Government reports piled up. Government promises echoed through meetings. Nothing changed across decades of inaction. Then one monk declared, "Enough, we clean it ourselves." No government budget, no foreign NGO funding, 3,000 volunteers armed with shovels and determination. But here's what nobody predicted would happen. 160 kilometers completely restored. The river flows clean again. And something even stranger occurred. Hand pumps dry for 40 years suddenly produced water. 6,000 acres of waterlogged land became farmable once more. But the media coverage hides the reality. Early cleanup attempts failed catastrophically as sewage diversions collapsed. Volunteer crews quit after weeks of backbreaking labor with no visible progress. Government officials mocked the effort as naive and doomed. Then the monk who started it all refused to quit. And what happened next proved that community action can accomplish what bureaucracy never could. If environmental restoration that transforms entire regions fascinates you, hit subscribe. You're about to see how one monk and 3,000 volunteers accomplished what decades of official promises never delivered. Along the banks of the Kali Bain, the water once carried more than just silt and fish. For Sikhs across Punjab, this river held sacred memory. Guru Nanak Dev, the founder of Sikhism, is believed to have meditated on its banks and emerged with a message that shaped a faith. Pilgrims came seeking blessings where the water flowed clear and cool, a living thread tying generations to their spiritual roots. But that current faded. Over decades, the river's story transformed from devotion to decay. What was once a pilgrimage site became a channel of loss. The water darkened, choked by untreated sewage from dozens of villages, by chemical waste from factories, by agricultural runoff from fields. Invasive water hyacinth spread across the surface thick and green, blocking sunlight and oxygen below. Fish vanished. The riverbed in places dried to cracked mud. In others, it festered with black, stagnant pools. The air hung heavy with the smell of rot. Children who might have played by the banks now kept their distance. Farmers, once reliant on the river's flow, watched their wells run dry. Even the sound of birds grew rare. Elders remembered mornings of ritual bathing and prayer, now replaced by warnings to avoid the water. The Kali Bain, a river that had carried the hopes of a people, had become a symbol of neglect. Sacredness gave way to sorrow, and the land itself seemed to mourn. But spiritual loss was only part of the catastrophe. What government did next proved institutional failure at its worst. Government agencies responded to the Kali Bain's decline with paperwork, not action. Over the course of 3 decades, state officials commissioned survey after survey. Reports detailed the river's collapse, pinpointed pollution sources, and recommended urgent intervention. Yet the only thing that moved was the stack of documents piling up in municipal offices. Budgets were announced with line items for cleanup and restoration, but the money sat untouched year after year. Paper mills and chemical plants continued dumping untreated waste into the water. Not a single factory was fined. Villages along the river's course sent sewage straight into the channel. Despite repeated promises from district boards to build treatment facilities, audit records from the 1970s through the 1990s show millions of rupees allocated for restoration, but almost nothing spent on the ground. The river, once a living artery for the region, was left to stagnate, while officials debated committee findings and drafted new proposals. Residents watched as their complaints disappeared into bureaucracy. Letters to state agencies went unanswered. Appeals at public meetings led to more studies, but never to enforcement. The faces behind these decisions remained anonymous. Names on letterhead, signatures on memos, but no one willing to take responsibility for the water turning black. Frustration grew with each unfulfilled promise until faith in government solutions faded entirely. But one man decided bureaucratic failure wasn't the final answer. Sant Balbir Singh Sechwal stood on the banks of the Kali Bain in July 2000, looking at a river that had become a symbol of loss. For years, he had watched government officials file reports, allocate budgets, and hold meetings. Yet nothing changed. The water remained black, the air thick with decay. In that stillness, Sechwal made a decision that would alter the course of the river and the lives around it. Known across Punjab as a religious leader and former project head at the Golden Temple, Sechwal believed that service to the community was not confined to prayer or ritual. He saw the river's collapse as a spiritual crisis demanding action, not just words. On that summer day, he announced a vow. If no one else would clean the Kali Bain, he would, not with government contracts or heavy machinery, but with his own hands and the help of anyone willing to join. He picked up a shovel and began to dig. There was no fanfare, no cameras or officials, just the sound of metal striking earth and the quiet resolve of a single figure working along the muddy bank. His message was simple and direct. If we don't restore our sacred river, who will? The concept of seva, selfless service, became his call to arms. Word spread from village to village. People who had lost hope began to gather, drawn by the idea that the river's fate was in their own hands. Sechwal's leadership was not about commanding crowds, but about setting an example. One man, one shovel, one vow. But one man couldn't clean 160 kilometers alone. What happened next turned individual action into mass movement. Word of Sechwal's vow spread quickly through Punjab's villages. At first, a handful of neighbors came to watch him work, unsure if one man with a shovel could do anything against a river choked by decades of waste. But the sight of someone actually digging, not just talking, drew more people each day. Soon, farmers who had once relied on the river for irrigation began showing up before dawn, shovels in hand, squeezing in hours of labor before heading to their fields. They understood better than anyone that water was life and that waiting for officials to deliver it meant waiting forever. Students joined after school, some still in uniform, eager to be part of something bigger than themselves. They carried baskets, cleared debris, and learned from elders who remembered the river's glory days. Even children too young for heavy work found ways to help, fetching water, gathering tools, or simply cheering on their parents. Each new pair of hands made the task seem less impossible. Women became the backbone of the effort, managing food, supplies, and the daily logistics that kept the crews moving. They organized communal kitchens along the riverbank, making sure no one went hungry during long days of labor. Some joined the cleanup themselves, wading into the water to pull weeds and haul silt. Elderly villagers, many of whom had lost hope years before, returned to the banks to offer advice, encouragement, and prayers. Their presence reminded everyone what was at stake. Not just a river, but a way of life. There was no paycheck or government order. There was no budget, no official uniforms, no outside funding. Everything came from the community. Tools, food, even fuel for tractors borrowed from local farms. Crews of 30 or 40 people tackled each stretch of river, rotating as needed so the work never stopped. By the end of the first season, more than 3,000 volunteers had joined the effort, each one driven by a mix of religious duty, community pride, and the simple conviction that the river could be saved if they acted together. But enthusiasm alone couldn't move the tonnage of silt and debris. What they did next required backbreaking physical labor. Shovels struck the riverbed before any machines ever did. Along the Kali Bain, the cleanup began with the most basic of tools: spades, baskets, and bare hands. Crews of volunteers spread out along the banks, digging into mud and silt that had built up over years of neglect. Each section of the river was tackled in turn. The channel widened by about 3 meters, deepened by 1 meter. The work was slow, methodical, and relentless. No bulldozers, no contracts, no outside engineers. Just neighbors working side by side, moving earth one basket at a time. Invasive water hyacinth had spread thick across the surface, strangling the flow and starving the river of oxygen. Teams waded into the green tangle, pulling the plants out by their roots and piling them on the banks. Clearing the hyacinth was not just about appearances. It let sunlight reach the water, brought back the current, and opened the way for fish to return. The river, once suffocating beneath a mat of weeds, began to breathe again. But the main threat came from what people could not see: untreated sewage pouring in from dozens of villages and factories. Instead of waiting for government pipelines, volunteers dug diversion trenches by hand, rerouting waste into settling ponds built at the edge of fields. These ponds let solids settle and water filter naturally through soil before reaching crops. It was a simple, low-cost solution. No chemicals, no electricity, just gravity and time. In some stretches, the crews built embankments from local stone and earth, stabilizing the banks and protecting against monsoon floods. Months and years. The riverbed changed months and years. The riverbed changed shape. Where there had been a narrow, stagnant drain, now a broader, deeper channel carried clean water downstream. But cleaning the river was only half the battle. What came next ensured it stayed clean. Clear water moved through the Kali Bain once more, carrying with it signs of life that had not been seen in years. Where the surface had been choked with weeds, now silver flashes darted beneath. The rohu fish, long vanished, returned to the current. Kingfishers perched on overhanging branches, their calls echoing across the banks as they hunted for minnows. Egrets and herons nested in trees that volunteers had planted along the river, their white wings bright against new green. The river that had been written off as a lost cause was alive again, and the change was visible to anyone who walked its length. Villagers took pride in the comeback. Children, once warned to stay away, now gathered to watch turtles bask on sun-warmed stones. Farmers paused at the water's edge, remembering when the river ran black and silent. In the mornings, elders gathered on the rebuilt ghats for prayer, their voices carrying over water that finally flowed clean. But recovery brought new responsibilities. The same hands that cleared silt and weeds now formed patrol committees, keeping watch for anyone tempted to dump rubbish or sewage back into the channel. When polluters were caught, the community imposed fines, small sums but enough to make the message clear. The river's health belonged to everyone. No one waited for government inspectors or court orders. The rules were enforced by those who had done the work. For the first time in decades, the Kali Bain was more than a memory. It was a living river guarded by the people who depended on it. But ecological recovery revealed something even more astonishing underground. A well that had been dry for 40 years is not supposed to flow again. Yet after the river ran clear, villagers along the Kali Bain discovered water rising in their hand pumps. First a trickle, then a steady gush. The explanation traces back to the simplest lesson in hydrology. When a river is healthy, it does more than carry water above ground. Clean water seeps down through riverbeds, recharging the aquifers below. For decades, silt, weeds, and sewage had sealed off this connection. The groundwater table dropped, and pumps across dozens of villages fell silent. Once the volunteers finished clearing the channel and restoring the river's flow, something remarkable happened underground. Water began to percolate through the soil again, refilling the natural reservoirs beneath the fields. In some places, the water table rose by more than 1.5 meters. Farmers who had written off their wells as lost to history now used them to irrigate crops and fill drinking pots. Local families still talk about the day the pumps awoke. Elders who had spent half their lives fetching water from distant sources now watched grandchildren draw it from their own backyard. The return of water meant more than comfort. It meant security, health, and a chance to farm once more. This was not a miracle of technology or government spending. It was the direct result of a community restoring its river, and with it, the promise of life below the surface. But water returning to wells was only one economic impact. What happened to the farmland shocked everyone. Fields once drowned by stagnant water and neglect began to yield again. Along the banks of the Kali Bain, 6,000 acres that had been written off as lost to waterlogging now stood green with crops. Farmers who had watched their land turn to marsh for years found that as the river cleared and flowed, their fields drained and dried. Wheat and rice harvests climbed with yields rising by as much as 30%. The return of the river's flow didn't just restore a waterway, it revived a rural economy. Villagers who had struggled with failing pumps and barren fields now saw their children working beside them at harvest. Families who once faced ruin were able to plant again, and the change was visible in every market and kitchen. The transformation did not go unnoticed. In 2008, Time magazine named Sant Balbir Singh Sichawal a hero of the environment, citing the restoration of the Kali Bain as proof that grassroots action could outpace government programs. The award brought international attention, But for Sichewal, the real honor was seeing the river and its people thrive. Delegations from across India and abroad began arriving in Punjab to study what had happened along the Kali Bain. They walked the length of the restored river, met with farmers, and listened as volunteers explained their methods. What they found was not a story of high budgets or imported technology, but a lesson in persistence, community, and the power of collective will. But Sichewal saw this success as just the beginning. What he did next spread the model globally. Sant Balbir Singh Sichewal never saw the Kali Bain as a one-off victory. From the start, he insisted that what worked in Punjab could work anywhere. The model was simple, low cost, and most importantly, free to share. No patents, no consultants, no hidden expenses. Just a set of principles any village, town, or city could follow. Treat water as sacred. Involve everyone. Use local labor and knowledge. Keep solutions affordable. Enforce accountability through the community. Make restoration a shared duty, not a job for outsiders. These 6 principles became the blueprint. When officials and environmentalists from other regions came asking how to clean their own rivers, Sichewal handed them more than a checklist. He offered real proof. Over 50 villages across Punjab have now adopted the same sewage treatment system first built by volunteers along the Kali Bain. Instead of waiting for government plants or foreign aid, these communities dug their own tanks, filtered waste naturally, and used the water for crops. The model spread not through top-down mandates, but through word of mouth and visible results. Sichewal's vision keeps expanding. In recent years, he has called for 2026 to be celebrated as River Conservation Year, a rallying point to remind the nation that rivers are lifelines, not drains. His message is clear. The tools to restore the world's waterways already exist. What's needed is the will to use them together for free. Sant Balbir Singh Sichewal cleaned 160 kilometers of sacred river starting July 2000, mobilizing 3,000 volunteers using basic tools, clearing 3-meter wider, 1-meter deeper channels, removing invasive water, hyacinth digging diversion trenches by hand, building settling ponds with no chemicals, reviving rohu fish, kingfishers, egrets, herons, establishing community patrol committees, restoring 40-year dry wells, raising water tables 1.5 meters, reclaiming 6,000 acres of waterlogged land, increasing yields 30%, receiving Time Magazine Hero of the Environment 2008, spreading model to 50 Punjab villages declaring 2026 River Conservation Year, proving government budgets weren't needed. From one monk with one shovel through 3,000 volunteers to 6,000 acres restored, this proves environmental destruction isn't permanent. It's community action waiting to happen. What impressed you most? The 40-year dry wells flowing again? The 6,000 acres reclaimed? The 50-village replication? Drop your reaction below. Thanks for watching, where rivers become clean and communities become powerful. Catch you in the next one.